This podcast is sponsored by AppDynamics. Software architects play a critical role in designing, executing, and migrating large infrastructures to the cloud. Download AppDynamics' free ebook, 10 Tips for Enterprise Cloud Migration, and launch your migration project with a proven plan. Download the ebook now at infoq.link/appdynamics.
Welcome to the InfoQ podcast. My name is Wes Rice and I'm your host. In addition to hosting the InfoQ podcast, I also get the privilege to chair a set of software conferences called QCon, including our latest one called QCon AI. Have you heard about QCon AI? QCon AI is the latest software conference. It's an AI ML data engineering conference with a twist. The focus isn't on data scientists. QCon AI is for the software engineer and discusses the practices of evolving the work that we do every day in leveraging machine learning and AI. If you're like the rest of us and you think software is eating the world, but AI is eating software, this is the conference for you. Check us out. You'll be glad you did. On this week's podcast, I'm talking to Emil Stolarsky and was initially recorded live at Strangeloop 2017. On today's podcast, Emil discusses the background work he did for his Strangeloop talk. In it, he discusses some of the patterns and practices of incident management at various industries outside of software. We discuss things like the airline industry, NASA. We even discuss how Walmart pushed decision-making down to the lowest level during national disasters. We do all this so that we can learn new things about software that other industries have already solved. It's a fun podcast. Hope you enjoy it. Thanks for listening. Welcome to the InfoQ podcast.
Thanks for having me.
Before we get to your talk at Strangeloop, let's talk a bit about the role that you have at Shopify. What do you do for Shopify today?
So I'm a production engineer at Shopify, which is basically our SRE role. I work on the caching and job infrastructure team. So we handle our whole cache setup and job queues and making sure that runs within our SLOs and whatnot.
So the talk that you did at Strangeloop was all about incident management. What does incident management look like at Shopify? And maybe answer that prior to this research with what other people are doing, what other industries are doing with incident management. What did it look like?
Before incident management at Shopify was really just the traditional, you had your on-calls. When somebody got paged, they just came in, fixed it, just standard way you would see everywhere else. And about a year ago, an engineer joined, Kirk Russell, and he came from Google and he was telling us about how they've adopted the NIM system, which is the National Incident Management System that the US government developed for managing large disasters. It's an evolution of the incident command system. And the idea is you formalize the process of having somebody run the response to an incident. And we took that idea and we ran with it. And so now today, when severe enough incident occurs, we have a ChatOps integration tool that we call IMOCbot, and we'll run the incident through that. And then we also have a designated role of an on-call for incident commanders. When the incident is severe enough, that person will get paged and they'll come in and they'll be managing the response to the incident entirely. And they won't actually be responding to it. So they'll make sure that we have all the appropriate on-call around. They have the tools they need. They'll be the ones who coordinate with our comms team to making sure our status page is updated. They'll be coordinating with leadership and other stakeholders. We've been slowly evolving, and that's sort of the kernel, I would say, of where this came from.
So basically the idea of having someone whose job and role it is focused on resolving the customer experience outage and not necessarily on tracking down kind of the different threads that might come out of that experience. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, exactly. Originally, when we were sort of first rolling out the system, you realized that that role has naturally always been there, but it's never been formalized. And sometimes people would feel comfortable enough doing it, and sometimes people wouldn't. But when we rolled it out, we also rolled it out with some training and talked about what entails actually making sure that, like, what does a good response look like outside of just fixing the underlying issue.
You mentioned ChatOps. Are you all co-located at the same place or are you distributed?
We have 5 offices spread across North America and one in the EU. But our production engineering team doesn't quite follow the sun model, but we have engineers across the world in multiple time zones.
So how has incident response been affected by being geographically distributed?
Well, it actually hasn't been an issue at all, just because we'll have multiple rotations for like AM and PM.
So the talk that you did at Strangeloop was called Incident Insights from NASA, NTSB, and CDC. What made you decide to look at industries like airline and transportation and how they handle incidents and compare that to software?
like I mentioned earlier, when Kurt joined, he was telling about how they adopted this model from the government. And I saw the effectiveness of us adopting this system. And when I was younger, I always watched air accident investigations. I remember like watching about how they'll like lay out all the pieces and they'll do this like great forensic analysis to figure out what went wrong. And at one point I realized two things. One, whenever there's an issue, we're trying to figure out what's wrong in the super complex system. And it's funny because at Shopify, we like to talk about how we're building an airplane while it's flying in the sky. So there was that connection. I decided to go back and sort of see, okay, well, what have they realized? Like, we all talk about how safe flying is. And when you look at the numbers, it's kind of mind-boggling. The NTSB has done something like over, I believe, 140,000 investigations, not just in air travel, across all transportation accidents. And to the point where today, if you flew on an airplane every single day, it would take about just shy of 4,000 years. I think the number is like 3,800 years to be in an accident. So clearly, they figured out some things. And it was this question of like, okay, well, they figured out all these things. Over time, we'll probably get there, but we can just circumvent that and go and figure it out. And so I started going and reading about what do we do in the airline industry. And then that naturally leads into, well, medicine does a bunch of things because you're handling a human life and it's a complex situation, it's a complex system. And then there's oil and gas, there's natural disasters, and how does the government and the military respond to these things. And it's just like, once you pull on this thread, you just see all these different industries and how they're interconnected and they've been sharing information. And it was almost like uncovering this world of this massive body of knowledge that I feel we've only started to like hit the tip of the iceberg. We're seeing incident management and the command system be spread out through a bunch of companies in the industry right now, but there's so much more. And that was really exciting. And I wanted to talk about some of the things I'd learned from there.
Go figure, software is not the first industry to have to run incident responses. Huh?
Right, yeah. We're very lucky, and we've been very lucky in the software industry. When our systems fail, they didn't have cataclysmic consequences or like disasters. And we've also been lucky in that only certain services that we've run have fallen to the limelight when they failed. Whenever every single nuclear accident gets reported and it makes the news, you legally required to report aviation accidents. There was sort of this writing on the wall that that's going to happen to us soon. So let's not wait until it gets so bad that we have to have somebody come in and tell us.
Let's learn from this other industry's experiences. There was a story that you told in the talk that was about the creation of a checklist, and it's in the aviation industry. Can you tell that story?
Yeah, so the story is in the 1930s, the U.S. Army/Air Force, since they were one back then, were trying to procure a new bomber. And a bunch of companies had gone out and built their designs and built prototypes, and they were going to show them off. And Boeing had built the B-17. And everybody was really excited about this because it could fly twice as far, it could hold much more weight or munitions. But then when they were doing the demonstration of the prototype, on their second launch, the airplane crashed about 30 seconds after liftoff. They tried to figure out like what had happened, what went wrong. So they took because at the same time, or something that was really interesting, is that the pilots piloting the aircraft were both, one was the head of the test pilot sort of corps, and the other was one of the chief test pilots for Boeing. So they were like, what happened? And they went back and tried to figure out. So one important thing is that the B-17 at this time was one of the most complex aircraft they had developed. And when they came back, they realized that the solution wasn't more training or more education. It was actually to develop a checklist. The reason being that the airplane is so complex that you can't hold all the context and all the different steps in your mind. So they developed this sort of the first checklist in the airline industry of what do you do before takeoff, during takeoff, right after takeoff, before landing, during landing, right after landing. And since then, it's sort of taken the whole industry by storm, where if you think about today, who uses checklists, you'll instantly think of pilots in a cabin going through their checklist.
It's the entire Department of Defense. I was actually in the military before I got into software, and checklists are just prolific. I was on a submarine, and there was nothing you could do without operating anything without a specific checklist. It was always checklist based. So you didn't forget to turn a valve when you were opening something up, for example.
So here's a very interesting fact. There's never been a nuclear accident on a nuclear submarine.
I know, I was on one.
How? Over like 60, 50, 60 plus years?
Training, 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 nonstop training.
And what has that industry learned? I don't think we need to be going for zero outages, zero issues, but it's kind of, we can't just look at that and look at that success and track record and say, we can't learn anything from there. And so those sort of stories are super exciting to me because there's like, it's kind of like, the answer is right there. We just have to go and like, the problem is like, sometimes when you're reading through a lot of this stuff, it's really dry. It's like 400 pages of a manual, and the first 10 pages are dedicated to make sure when you purchase something to keep the receipt so you can expense it.
Exactly.
You're just like, okay, like, thanks, but didn't really need that. But then there's like nuggets in between as you're going through, and you're like, oh, like that's a really interesting story. That's a really interesting story. That's a really interesting lesson.
There was another story you told that I thought was pretty cool, and it was about crew resource management and how when someone finds an issue, how they vocalize it and how they bring that up. What was that story?
So the story was United Airlines 173, and it was a flight from New York to Portland with a stopover in Denver. And the flight was normal up until Denver. And then on approach to landing in Portland, as they were lowering the gears, the pilots had heard a thump. And the landing gear light didn't turn on, indicating that the landing gear went down successfully. So they started doing a go-around and flying around the airport to try to debug the issue and figure out what's going on. And they did that for about an hour. And then as they were coming into land, all 4 engines had stalled out, and the airplane crashed just before the runway. And during the investigation, they went and looked at the data, the flight recorder and whatnot, and it turned out that they had run out of fuel, which is why the engines had stopped. And that both the co-pilot and the flight engineer had indicated multiple times that they were running out of fuel and that they were low on fuel.
So focused on trying to debug and troubleshoot a problem, forgot about worrying about the customers that were on the plane, I guess.
He never acknowledged the issue, and both the pilot and the flight engineer didn't know what to do because back then there was this, you don't question what the captain says. During that investigation and around this time, there was a lot of accidents that were occurring where the root cause, or one of the main reasons for them like happening, is pilots weren't able to sort of propagate the information enough, or maybe it was something that could have been easily dealt with, but the teamwork just broke down. And there's like flight recorder after flight recorder where someone will call it an issue, it goes ignored, or it doesn't get fixed, and then there's an accident. And so what happened is NASA went off and developed sort of a scheme or a framework for communicating. They developed crew resource management, which is this framework for how to communicate in a cabin, during issues, and just in general. And so it's like really, when you go and read it, it's really basic things. It's like, call out the person that you're talking to. Tell them what the problem is. State why you think that's the problem. State how you want to fix it. Wait for an acknowledgement. And you're reading this, you're like, of course. But then I thought back while I was going through this like crew resource management material, and I thought back to all the different incidents I've seen at Shopify where something's bad, a lot of people jump in to help, people are throwing in different solutions and what they think the problem is. And then when we fix it, we look back in the retrospective and we see, hey, somebody had called out the proper issue at the very beginning. And you wonder, like, pilots have had to deal with this, airlines have had to deal with this, we're dealing with this right now. And so that was really neat because it's like, oh, we have a system for fixing these issues. The other thing is like when I was going and listening to pilots talk about near misses, you would never fail to hear them mention crew resource management. They would be like, I told my co-pilot to go work on the issue. And there was no question. We just knew we had that communication structure down. When pilots are training, crew resource management is always sort of at the top of the mind, always drilled into their heads.
So both of those are really cool stories that affect the airline industry. What other stories did you run across that maybe were non-airline or NASA? I guess airline and NASA, I guess that's same space.
Aerospace, yeah.
No pun intended.
So there was the story around Katrina and how Walmart prepared for Katrina was very interesting, where Walmart knew that there'd be essentially chaos going on during the hurricane, and they pushed down responsibility to store managers and gave them the leeway and told them that, hey, whatever comes up, make the right decision. And you've got really interesting stories of how store managers, so I mentioned the story during my talk, a store manager in Louisiana, the local response teams needed supplies, but they couldn't get into the store. So she took a bulldozer and drove through the walls, got the supplies, brought them out into the parking lot and gave them away for free. And then she broke into the pharmacy in the store and gave the medicine to a local hospital that needed it.
That's taking it to extremes.
But it's sort of like when your service is down, just because somebody isn't in leadership, you don't want them waiting to maybe make a decision that could bring the service back up. Another one is how foresight and planning in ahead and how powerful that can be. So after Katrina, Walmart was one of the first organizations to bring supplies into the city because the South of America is prone to hurricanes, and they've developed their supply chains in such a way that they can survive, I guess, these natural disasters.
That's cool. So at the very beginning, you were talking a bit about what incident response looks like at Shopify. How do you think these stories have affected or will affect how you do incident response at Shopify?
One thing we're going to be looking at is crew resource management. And during our on-call training, how can we formalize the communication structure? And how can we keep it... We don't want too much process. We're not an airliner. We don't fly airplanes. And so there's finding that balance between, hey, look at what other industries have sort of had to deal with. We deal with similar problems, and let's pick and choose and test some of these nuggets and see how that works. The other thing is, so I mentioned earlier, we have a chat ops tool that manages our incident command structure and responding to incidents. We're going to be looking at integrating checklists into that. So we can put sort of the most basic things so we don't have to sort of think of the basic things when we're doing a response. I think I mentioned it in the talk that how checklists are the sort of thought automation. You don't want to have to think through the obvious stuff. You're going to have to change the status page. If you ship bad code, you're going to have to lock deploys or revert. And so checklists help you not have to think about that. You can focus your mental cycles on the more complex issues and debugging the actual problem at hand. And so the idea would be, say, let's drop a checklist in and say, update the status page, lock deploys, update the stakeholders. And it's, funny enough, similar to what pilots have, where in the cabin, in the middle dashboard, you'll have checklists that pilots can go through. We always picture it as books, but it's actually a computer that you can fall back to a book afterwards. So we'll be rolling out those two things and looking at how we can integrate them into our incident response. And then going from there and seeing what other tidbits we can grab from industries.
So if someone wants to follow up on your work, or obviously they need to go watch your video, but aside from that, they want to follow up on some of the stuff that you've done, what would you recommend to them?
Sidney Decker has written books on postmortems and how to sort of identify root causes, which I think is really interesting. Todd Conklin is a researcher in the safety/organizational behavior field, which has a great podcast called Pre-Accident Investigations. What he'll do is he'll actually go and interview people in different fields, and he'll ask them about how they deal with incident response, how they deal with emergencies, how they deal with safety. So one of the interviews there is from the fire chief in Belgium, in Antwerp. Another one is on the safety in scuba diving. Another would be a surgeon and how they deal with sort of doing retros, and how they'll aim for there's no legal repercussions when they'll do that retrospective, or how they'll do it in a closed door. So it's interesting seeing how when John Allspaw and Dave Zweibeck come in and they're talking about how we do incident response in the tech industry, it's almost like people are going, for everybody in that community, in the incident response community, they're like, oh, that's interesting, look at these things they can pick up. And so I really love his podcast just because it's like a 30, 40-minute, dip the toes into what this whole industry thinks about and all the different approaches and problems they deal with. And then you can like immediately see the connections in different times, or you can see a disconnect, and you can see about how, it'd be really valuable if they took our ideas. So definitely that podcast is great.
Cool. So what surprised you most? What caught you off guard? What were you not expecting to learn about this?
The effectiveness of checklists. I had always thought checklists were taking the thinking out of something. It's too complex. Follow these steps. Don't question it. And it's just sort of process. And that's how I kind of dismissed it too easily. And it's funny when you read about them, it turns out everybody dismisses them immediately for that reason. But when you dive into it and you look at the numbers and the data and whatnot, they're such an invaluable tool that you're almost saying, I'd like longer outages if you're not using them. I'd like systems to not recover fast enough. Because with checklists, like I said earlier, what you're really doing is you're getting rid of the obvious. You're not thinking about the obvious, which totally makes sense. That's what we're doing in tech all the time. We're like trying to automate our responses and whatnot. And this is just an automation for the things we can't put into a program.
What overlaps, what similarities have you seen in software that could be affected by some of the things you've learned through this research?
So I was recently reading about alerting philosophy in the Google SRE book. I was also reading about the 3 Mile Island incident. And diving more into it, during the accident, they had 700 alerts go off, and they had a single printer that would indicate issues in the nuclear power plant. What had happened is when they saw the 700 alerts, the operators had thought something was faulty, and they just decided to ignore all of them. And in this alerting philosophy chapter, they're talking about how you don't want too much noise in your alerting. You want clear observability into the system to figure out exactly what's going on. They had, I believe it was a single gauge to indicate something was wrong at 3 Mile Island. And so afterwards, there was sort of a bulletin issued about when you're designing alerting systems, make sure you can sort of clarify what the key issues are and that there's multiple sort of indicators. And we're talking about it now with our alerting.
Yeah, that's totally cool. Thanks for taking time to chat. If you enjoyed what you just heard and you want to hear Emil's full talk, check out Strangeloop's YouTube channel. They've got these videos all online. And look for the talk Incident Insights from NASA, NTSB, and CDC from Emil Stolarsky. Emil, thanks for chatting with us.
Thanks for having me on the show.